Thanks for the invitation. I just confirmed that I have a bit more time since some of the speakers dropped off. At all. So this is an elaboration of the paper I had submitted to the book, which by the way I think it's a fantastic book. A superb resource, a lot of fantastic articles. Introduction by Mark, particularly very interesting. So I'm proud to be part of that. The article I submitted, I mean this book was long in the making, so it's a little bit old. Written it about somewhere 2 years ago or so. So that's why I took the liberty to elaborate and integrate particular concepts and arguments I'm making in the larger project. Which I started to lecture upon, which is my own book called The Autopoiesis of Architecture, where I set up a series of notions to construct a framework within which I discuss all and everything which is to do with architecture, and therefore the diagram also must be discussed, as far as I'm concerned, within its framework. I start with 10 premises to the argument, which basically apply the kind of overall framework to the conceptualization of the diagram in architecture. The premise 1, which is also thesis number 1 of my theoretical treatise, reads: the phenomenon of architecture can be most adequately grasped if it is analyzed as autopoietic system, that is, a self-referentially closed network of communications. The communications of architecture comprise drawings, text, and built works, and then continues notion which you can read, but it's not central to this argument, about the function of architecture as a whole. The second point I want to make, second premise, is that society, under this notion, is the totality of all communications, differentiated into the various social subsystems that communicate within society as self-referentially closed systems of communication. The primary mode of differentiation within contemporary society is functional differentiation. Now, to locate architecture within that, I'm arguing architecture is one of the great autopoietic function systems of contemporary society. It operates in parallel and co-evolves with the other great function systems, like the political system, the economic system, etc. I'm too tall for that lectern somehow. So these function systems have achieved both universal and exclusive competency for a particular societal domain of communication necessary for the ongoing societal reproduction. So architecture is one of those. Another general statement: the special efficacy of each of the great function systems relies on the specialized media of communication that have respectively developed within each of these function systems. And that starts to locate the diagram. So it's a comparative analysis in which I discuss architecture as part of an overall societal process. So for instance, if you compare the different media, I'm saying, for instance, the medium of money in the economic system, the medium of power in the political system, and the medium, the equivalent in architecture, the medium of drawing/modeling in the system that is the autopoiesis of architecture together with the design disciplines. Number 5, premises, elaborating: the function of these specialized media is very general, in very general terms, that cover all of them, is to make otherwise highly improbable communications or social interactions probable, and indeed a daily occurrence that can be expected. That's very abstract. But I'll try to elaborate. So money makes the improbable probable, namely that we are able to be relaxed, non-envious onlookers with respect to the consumption and enjoyment of others. That means without demanding our share whenever we see others eat, for instance. We can do this, and that's not to be taken for granted, because originally you couldn't do that in the kind of more primitive forms of society. We can do this because we have money, the universal equivalent in our pocket. And now we can all at any time go into a shop, grab something, entertain ourselves, etc. Now, power is another of those. Special media with the function of making the improbable probable makes the improbable probable, namely that we continuously follow both general constraining rules as well as the concrete instructions of our superiors against our natural instincts, desires, and the immediate drive for organic comfort. Also something highly improbable. And we need a kind of special medium of power to communicate and have these kind of communications accepted and reproduced. Now, the equivalent role and function of the drawing with respect to architecture's overall function. The medium of drawing modeling makes the improbable probable, namely that we are able to convince ourselves, as well as clients, stakeholders, and the community at large, that they should invest resources now and trust us as architects with the creation of a complex, novel, unseen, long-term built environment that will not be available for inspection before it has been constructed a few years down the line. Something very, very demanding to have such communications operating. And it, like money and power, the medium is universally applicable with respect to all aspects of the built environment, and indeed the totality of the world of designed artifacts. And only with the special medium of drawing you can convince yourself and others to speculate and innovate radically into a distant future, consuming huge resources and engaging many, many people under such a project. So, like money and power, in their respective domains, economic exchange and political decision-making and administration, this medium is universally applicable, as I said, with respect to all aspects of the built environment and indeed the totality of the world of designed artifact. The specialized medium thus supports our exclusive and universal competency and control, discursive control at least, over the totality of the built environment and the world of artifacts. Premise number 9. In an evolving, increasingly complex and demanding societal innovation, each of the co-evolving function systems is burdened with the requirement of continuous adaptive upgrading. This also includes the continuous adaptive upgrading of the respective specialized media. New forms of money and financial instruments are evolving and have evolved. New mechanisms for social control and the administration of power. New design tools and techniques within the medium of architecture. And now we're coming closer to the topic of today in terms of parametric diagrams. So all of them opportunizing, that's a kind of interesting coincidence, all of them opportunizing on the advancing technologies of computational information processing. The final premise, before I get into the meat of the argument: the diagram as a special central component within the arsenal of architecture's specialized medium is not excluded from the burden and opportunity of adaptive upgrading via harnessing advanced computational information processing. Yeah, so much in terms of premises. It's crucially uncomfortable here too. I've introduced two distinctions which I find pertinent to discuss the role of diagrams in this great project of architecture and design. I've distinguished ordinary diagrams versus extraordinary diagrams, and I've distinguished metric diagrams versus parametric diagrams. It will be clear what this means. The first of the two distinctions is to do with the, what I call the external constitution of the diagram. It has to do with the role of the diagram in a kind of discursive practice, whether it's a kind of routine established practice. That gives sense to a diagram as an ordinary diagram. The metric versus parametric is concerned with the internal constitution of the diagram, how its elements are constituted and interact or not. Anyway, these two distinctions stand orthogonal with respect to each other. I have the ordinary extraordinary dimension as a dimension of external constitution, metric parametric dimension as a dimension of internal constitution, and therefore I generate 4 categories, which in turn I will go through and discuss. So there's a metric ordinary, which is maybe what everybody's familiar with, and the trivial case, if you like. Then there is the metric extraordinary, which is something which emerged somewhere in the 20th century. And then on the parametric level, there's also the parametric ordinary, and there's also the parametric extraordinary, which here the time of the arrow of time goes actually reverse. We're moving from the extraordinary to the ordinary, as I shall argue. So metric ordinary diagrams. The first one, I'm also mentioning a text, is in fact where this becomes very powerful and concrete in the work of Durand and his teaching in Paris at the Polytechnic. He is able to have these have a kind of new free-flowing combinatorics on the diagrammatic plane to generate an unseen and unheard of variety of architectural types and forms. So you see the power of diagramming. Compare this to the classical canon. But what is interesting about this is that the kind of translation as a routine or precisely anticipated translation is set because of the classical canon, which is broken down into modules and then up for kind of recombination and resetting in the diagrammatic process. So, and this goes further from the kind of two-dimensional diagrams into the parts, which have their own kind of variety. For instance, just porches, and porches go straight forward into the full elevational setup. And Durand is claiming that there's a kind of inevitable clarity of logic of translating plans into sections. It's a kind of an automatic process, routine process, which makes this a whole process very proliferous and strong, but at the same time very safe and known, and that's what I call the ordinary diagrammatic process or diagram. So this move from the highly abstract diagram, and let's say all of these 4 categories share one feature, which is this radical degree of abstraction that's given. But that dimension is also, as we later see, capable of being amplified and increased. So this is the translation as secure and predictable translation on the basis of routine practice. That's in the end the definition, if you like, of the ordinary diagram. Now it really comes to its fullest, I would argue, as we move from neoclassicism to modernism. And I don't, by the way, just an interlude, I don't think that Charles Jencks' notion of a kind of ever-increasing polyphony and pluralism of styles is what we're looking at. It's a very specific moment in history where things appeared like this, namely the moment of postmodernism where Jencks is kind of at home in. And I believe in that since then things have kind of clarified again, and ultimately things tend towards binary oppositions and resolve into hegemonic styles. So we can dissect the historical evolution into epochs which are systemically unifying an epoch under a hegemonial style. We can talk about the neoclassicism for the 19th century and modernism for the first half of the 20th century. Going back to, and you know, some of you know what I'm talking about for the 21st century. But as we move from neoclassicism to modernism, we're witnessing an increase of abstraction, and that is increasing the level and range of abstraction, which implies an increasing scope. Modernism is the first architectural style which is truly universal in its scope and claim, not just dealing with churches, palaces, and special public buildings. And it is increasing the innovative prowess of architecture. And you have also, I want to show us in terms of modernist diagrams, so they become much more richer, they're open-ended, they're not just shifting about classical modules around symmetry axis, but they're more far-reaching. But you can at the same time, there are certain principles which govern and constrain the modernist diagram, which have something to do also with the graphic repertoire which is employed, the kind of privileging of the crisp line of boxes within boxes and next to boxes, etc. So we have to overcome the kind of sense, there's a kind of dialectic between form and content, and the kind of formal repertoire of diagram making constrains the kind of contents which can be expressed and manipulated and projected. Some of these principles like segmentation of tasks, depersonalization, specialization is what characterizes modernist institutions are mirrored in the way modernist architecture separates out domains, keeps the connection very, very minute, and then has within each subdomain radically different from each other, not like the classical where they're all similar, but internally repetitive. So these are the principles, the tools, and this takes place on all sorts of levels. Again, you see here, separating out rather different segments, different depths, different height, but internally repetitive and minimizing connections, and that happens on all levels and scales. And the paradigmatic translation is unproblematic. Perhaps even the direct translation of the diagram into build form. And you can see here again separation, specialization, repetition at work. And it has also enormous expansion of freedom of articulating a rich and more complex and varied forms of institutional setups and settings. And the ability to specialize building volume, building depths, floor-to-floor height, fenestration, etc. And that goes again with the industrialized, mechanized modes of reproduction. This goes into urban planning, city planning. The same principles apply to Le Corbusier's Villeradieu's. And the translation is rather straightforward. It's expanding. And somebody like Le Corbusier, who kind of set this out, he's not the only one, but he formalized, canonized, and laid down in his Towards a New Architecture the founding document of modernism for the next 50 years of expansion worldwide. In a sense, is exercising architecture's exclusive and universal competency and radically transforms the global human habitat. And the ordinary metric diagram is a tool of this omnipotence. And this goes also in modernism, is also of course affecting the totality of industrial design and the total world of artifacts, not just the built environment under architecture's guidance. And so that so Le Corbusier can make sketches like this, and there's a whole system of translation, of hardlining, scaling, and translating this through the kind of different design stages. There's a kind of machine of translation, and which brings this into reality. And there's also a machine of reading this out and understanding and navigating and using that on the user side. And that total machine of translation as an external constitutes through its kind of external network the fact that this is an ordinary diagram. Now, this goes into urbanism. I couldn't find that sketch where Le Corbusier is designing the diagramming Europe as a network of city with linear city. So this seems to be able to go as far as you want, and you have this kind of notion of the linear city crossing the United States. Now, where are we going with this? I mean, I'm saying there's perhaps a moment, maybe we're convinced for a moment that this is possible, but there is inflation. the potential, the danger of inflation is always there. So I'm saying the medium of the diagram, drawing model, like power, like money, is subject to the danger of inflation. Money, everybody knows, but also power. If you kind of scream around too much and don't, consequences don't follow, power just kind of overstretches and disintegrates. So the attempt to make the improbable probable overstretches the value and the of or the trust in the medium, and the medium potentially collapses or loses credibility. And that happened with the, let's say, the end game of the modernist diagram going out, and we have Paul Rudolph, and then a few years, it's just, and some Charles Jencks announced in a way what happened, the kind of death of all this, the modernism, this collapse into incredibility. And you have this wonderful book of Rainer Benham talking the urban futures of the recent past. When he published this in the 70s, late 70s, I think, or early 80s, these kind of extrapolations, the last endgame extrapolation of modernism seems like an absurd dystopian nonsense, and all this came crashing down. But I'm not saying it's only because kind of the medium was inflated. There are, of course, deeper reasons for this, which have to do with the modernism relating to Fordist reproduction paradigm coming into crisis. But you have also diagrams like this in the most radical sense, the most radical modernist diagrams, which at that stage in Archizoom and Superstudio are ironic, dystopian expositions, if you like. And this is not, serious. This just shows the explodes. The whole thing explodes like a kind of supernova. Pops. Now, before I go in what happened then, and I'm saying that this is the end game of the extraordinary metric diagram, where salvation, that's kind of actually was in the extraordinary diagram, which I'm talking about as the next stage. But before I go there, we need to say that to make that next step, the profession, in fact, and it started in the late 60s, early 70s, differentiated its communication process into two sub-segments, the avant-garde on the one side and the mainstream on the other. This is kind of the first glimpse of that at the beginning of the modernism, but modernism doesn't know that distinction, in fact, eradicates it. But since the late 60s, we have a permanent condition of avant-garde versus mainstream. Some people try to deny that and think you all should be one big kind of, it sounds elitist and so on. There's various resistances to this concept. I think this concept is self-evident. Why is that happening? We have the differentiated domain of communication allowing us, and all of us here are belonging to the avant-garde, except for Hanif perhaps, collaborating on both sides of the divide. And we are moving actually, and that's why I'm glad he is here. We're trying to move from the avant-garde into the mainstream, but on our own terms, of course, setting new terms. So, but it is the purpose of the avant-garde, of course, is that we're having huge crisis. What's been going, the kind of techniques of innovation and thinking were bankrupt. We have to gear up. Innovation has to go more far stretching and radical, which means it has to take more risks. And that's why you need to insulate that risk in an avant-garde which isn't directly responsible for continuing the reproduction of contemporary life. That has to go on in parallel now until something new has been developed in the avant-garde segment. And the whole purpose is at the same time to cope with this huge crisis, but also in general to accelerate innovation, because I'm arguing that this distinction sticks, and we will see this will not go away. We will have an avant-garde and a mainstream for the next 100 years of architecture. So the order of architecture differentiates into avant-garde and mainstream, and I see a further differentiation of the avant-garde. I mean, first of all, it's design research in the avant-garde as its functions, and the state-of-the-art routines have to continue. Life goes on. You can't just stop and wait. You have to build the next airport anyway. You can't wait for the avant-garde to come up with a sensible, meaningful, new language of architecture. So design research on the side of the avant-garde, that's its purpose. It's specialized and differentiated for this purpose. We need to recognize that because we all are and constitute the avant-garde here. And there are, I would argue, two styles, or two ways. There are revolutionary research, and this is, I think, not a parallel so much phenomenon, but a kind of sequential phenomenon. There are cycles of innovation styles start with revolutionary research and research periods, and then they move on and advance to cumulative research periods. And that's where the extraordinary diagram can be located on the side of revolutionary research. That's its function. So we are looking at the moment, we're moving on therefore to the metric extraordinary diagrams. They look like this, and they first appeared at the point of crisis of modernism. Liebeskunst Micromegas. So what is clear here that there is not this definite full system of translation where I can click, make it next, click the image forward and have a fully developed, rational, meaningful, acceptable solution. So, and also, I mean, I'm very familiar with Zaha and my own work. I'm grown up as a student in that period, the early 80s. And that's the kind of diagrammatic processes we're looking at. These are kind of graphic spaces, graphic marks. Their meaning is unclear. We don't know if this translates into walls, into force fields, into lines, into paths, into what? They're kind of abstract configurations, diagrammatic. They don't know what they're going to be. They're full of potency and latency, and I'm calling therefore these also kind of aleatory diagrams. That's this when I stepped into the office in the late 80s, 88. We did this kind of work, competitions on urbanism. And this goes also fluid. And it goes on, I created these at a certain point. They're just, we don't know what we're talking about except for particular new organizational paradigms of not going away from the dialectic of object background into kind of objects crystallizing out of field densities, perhaps. We're talking about kind of proliferation of interlocking domains, no longer box against box, and emergent zones and patterns out of this, but they're left at this, and to a certain extent they're just expanding the graphic repertoire. I'm just by fiat saying these are diagrams which will become architecture, but I don't know how. And all the projects, and to this day, to a certain extent, have that. But as we build up the repertoire, as we've done the translation a few times, there's a kind of routinization to a certain extent of this. And we can turn these diagrams into structure, into path, into various ways. And the Rome project was developed like this. We didn't know quite what these lines would mean, become to mean, just alignments, connections, or physical entities. What kind of physical entities one would not yet know. You can elaborate these still on the level of extraordinary, aleatory kind of totally open systems. And you can give them color, you can give them detail, you can hardline them. That doesn't change the character because it's externally constituted, whether it is an ordinary or extraordinary diagram. It's nothing to do with the internal structure of the markings themselves. And therefore, all of these have the potential to devolve into fully ordinary. They could become ordinary as a practice through a process of selection, reproduction, produces. They can be three-dimensional, like early DRL work in the mid-90s. And then the various teaching arenas, where you could say they're kind of starting to, we know more what this is going to be. There's a kind of transmutation from the ordinary into the extraordinary, from the extraordinary into the ordinary. And also showing this, that to a certain extent, you could say that a new phenomenon happened with the development of the avant-garde. Some of the built work remains in the status of the diagram, of the extraordinary diagram. So the Parc de la Villette is not, doesn't really, its purpose is not to sustain a real life process of a kind of suburban Parisian families, but it is a manifesto project, like the Rietveld House perhaps, which its purpose is to be this kind of diagrammatic, built in three-dimensional space, extraordinary diagram, which is yet to be interpreted, yet to be drawn into a real life process. And that was, by the way, a lot of times the kind of urban parks had that functions of a proto-urbanism, a proto-spatial structures. So whether it's built or not doesn't even matter. So diagrams can be line diagrams, they can generate, they can gain color, three-dimensionality, they can be physical models, and they can be real buildings. And we've done extraordinary diagrammatic environments which become, instead of the designer in the ongoing extraction of features and enhancing and selecting and reproducing of features in an aleatoric process, like Da Vinci, drawing a beautiful landscape painting out of watermarks on the wall, the users would kind of read and draw out and concretize and utilize and functionalize these kind of abstract, extraordinary built diagrams. And that's why anything could start to serve as an extraordinary diagram of innovative design research. And that experience we made when I was at school in London, we just did anything. And I'm sure Neil is very familiar to these kind of processes, and still works like this to a large extent. So you can make all sorts of mappings and photography, and you see Tschumi did that. Anything can be drawn in and placed on the paper and called proto-architecture, thus by fiat, by the sheer willpower of wanting to translate it somehow. I don't know yet how, and once I've gone through it once and I do it again, I can do it faster and faster, and it builds into a routine. And I think we have routinized these kind of models into a kind of streamlined new process. So extraordinary diagrams are aleatoric diagrams. They function via reading. That's not just reading. That's not reading a book. That's a specialist term, which was very familiar in the out of post-structuralism. Understood as free browsing, oscillating association, and finding meaning, forcing meaning into it. And that's why I have another kind of loop in the theoretical reflection, where I am allowing us to see that in terms of the diagram in front of us, once you take away routine translation and familiarity, there is no objective constitution of its form, its geometry, its order. That is something which comes only in the dialectic of understanding it, and the proof of understanding is drawing out in the process of translation its meaning. But that is a creative, active process, like what happens in perception at every moment. So I'm not sure if you would make any sense of this, if this is anything to you, how you decompose the scene, where you see points of references and unities. It is in fact Picasso's Woman with Guitar from 1911, but I'm not sure if that helps. And this one is easier. And then if your eye travels, if you look for a while on the left side and then move to the right, you might be able to see it. So the kind of familiarization or triggers will bring elements into place. And that's what I think always goes on when you sketch and work with extraordinary diagrams and process them. You process them on the basis of cognitive processes. And that's been studied. That's what Cubism is all about, by the way. And first glimpse of this discovered in Impressionism. And that's why you can kind of, there's no objective circles here in terms of real contiguity or interaction. These are just easy reds. And there's, one can look at, I'm fast forwarding perhaps to this, but the grouping principles, how do you construct unities out of a kind of manifold in your visual field? And yes, proximity. These are just simply closest, that's why these were lines. These become unities, and these not. But then similarity would override this. Although these are closer together, similarity, suddenly you see lines across here. So you have different micro aspects of this. Here this might be, look at this, it could be these two continuous lines, or it could be these two V shapes, or this way. And smooth continuation wins. Those are some of the mechanisms of our perception, but it could, you could bring it into a state of oscillation, where it remains very open. This one again, usually you would start to see at the bottom top left, that's a square with two frames. You resolve it like this. Why not like this? If you introduce a little gap here, maybe that's the privilege, or the two M's. So all the time, whatever you look at, there's always this multiplicity of decomposition and the construction of unities. They're always subjective in this sense, and they depend on the routines of translation, which are giving order and form to these. And there are more of this, and the famous one, the figure ground, what you see, the positive, the negative, rise or the faces. Symmetry helps to draw you here to the white and here to the black. Symmetry is a factor in this. And this seems to be a kind of very amorphous, irregular shape, which is more amorphous, but as through mirroring, the stronger the symmetry, the more powerful as it flips over through the symmetry. So I'm looking at these, and these are always at play and at work, just as an interlope. And this is very powerful in architecture in particular, because instead of the world of artifact, it's quite clear. I can pick that bottle off the table, so it travels against the background, so to see that there's unity is easier. In architecture, there is no thing which is traveling against it. Everything is kind of connected and drawn together. It's highly ambiguous, so that it can only be subjectively decomposed. Of course, if that bottle would travel together with the glasses in a kind of swarm interaction, then I would see that as a unity as well. So even physical contiguity is not necessarily the ultimate notion. Yes, flocks of birds, swarms of fish, and so on. Now I'm moving on to the distinction metric versus parametric diagrams, and I'm talking about now the internal constitution of the diagram with respect to its elements. At the same time, we're talking about the shift from modernism to parametricism. And there are transitional episodes like postmodernism and deconstructivism, and they have to do with the dwelling, and they have been dwelling in the extraordinary diagram. Anyway, so in terms of the shift from modernism to parametricism, I'm talking about this ontological shift. Now, what are the components of diagram? What are the kind of primitives, the graphic primitives or geometric primitives by which we constitute? And before parametricism, before the 1990s, in fact, this was the repertoire of architecture primarily. That's the classical repertoire, but also that's all there is to modernism, because this diagram is from Le Corbusier's towards new architecture. It's ideal, rigid, hermetic, geometric figures, and architecture has to do with the composition of these. Modernism was a bit more free in how these were disposed of, and was free in terms of the proportions of the elements. Something wholly other and radical different happens when we talk about splines, blobs, NURBS, particles, which are tied together with scripts. Every primitive here becomes fully malleable and creating a kind of densely internally interrelated systems. I will not go in much more detail to it and look at the diagrams. I'm discussing diagrams in particular, rather than the totality of the style and significance. And I could have shown a kind of points become kind of points in a particle swarms, lines become kind of interactive splines, and a kind of force fields and permanent reconfiguration. They speak to each other like in the hair dynamic tools. And on that level of abstraction, these are extraordinary parametric diagrams, if you like. I move on with same happens in a sense to surfaces and their manipulation. They're inherently malleable and therefore adaptive. They can start to correspond and correlate and interact and affiliate with others, but as such, first of all, they're just as primitives self-differentiating. And that's a kind of point line plane of Kandinsky updated into the era of parametricism. They could develop character, behavior, etc. Demeanor, and then the volume side we have kind of the blob and blob formations, metabols, etc. And we've been using that, of course, extensively in particle swarms and various ways of translation, which were unclear, but there's translation going on of drawing that out. At the beginning it remains very abstract, unclear, and multifarious. And you can kind of start to define and draw out consequences, and we have a whole series of these, and you can enrich this, of course, with color, with density, with behavior. Could become three-dimensional. So, but I'm not, so we have a lot of experience. I've been working and continue to work with extraordinary parametric diagrams as a kind of engine of evolution. And the parametric part, this kind of interaction, means simply that everything becomes, we now be able to intensify relations. We don't have to keep things separate from each other, discrete and zoned away from each other. Contemporary society needs much more interaction and complexity. The articulation of complexity needs kind of this that things register each other, respond to each other, act towards each other at a distance, and kind of create kind of coherent, complex, variegated order. But at the same time, you need to recognize that we're moving into ordinary parametric diagrams as we translate. And we should not kind of privilege only, the avant-garde cannot stay forever in the domain of the extraordinary, if you like. So as research advances from revolutionary research to cumulative research, that is, as parametricism matures and establishes, as I'm arguing, hegemony within the avant-garde, in order to build up the capacity to conquer the mainstream, the ultimate game, on our terms, the diagrams must transform from extraordinary parametric diagrams to ordinary parametric diagrams. That means we need to routinize, to be strategic and have cumulative research and not just keep dabbling in the first few steps of playing with animation tools. We need to advance to the stage of cumulative research, and this proceeds as follows. Mutations, variations are selected and then reproduced by repetition, routinization, and socialization. That means the project becomes a collective project, which hopefully everybody in this room and everybody beyond this room in the domain of architecture participates under the headline of a coherent, well-argued, and promising collective research projects. And that's why I'm talking about the style, and I'd like to have the style to be hegemonic, so that we are really having a funneling of creative forces and intelligences rather than a kind of fragmentation of creative forces and intelligences, which somebody like Charles, born in a different era, is still celebrating. Because at that stage there wasn't such a project, it was unclear, we had to go out in all directions, but if we go out in all directions forever, then mainstream continues unchallenged. And you can see that, and the big lineup is still parametricism versus modernism. Go to see David Chipperfield's powerful exhibition at the Design Museum. You can see the battle line drawn. You see where it works, where it doesn't work. And I think it's clear to me where the advantages lie. So we're having developed these techniques, and they're becoming ordinary tools where we have systems of translation in place, the differentiation of the repertoire, the interpretation, the kind of contextualization, and the power of affiliation and adaptation. I'm nearly finished, don't worry. And intelligence brought in, calculation brought in, criteria fed in, without losing the essence of the complexity organization, and opportunizing on these, in fact, and really creating convincing environments, just as an example of the intelligence which you can now incorporate into the diagrammatic process. That, soon as discrete and proper intelligence brought in this kind of structural Catena kind of diagrams to create clusters of domes, you are in the domain of what I call ordinary. Maybe you have to find a new phrase for this, sounds so kind of something. people wouldn't like to kind of engage in, perhaps, but I might rephrase that, but I'm in the domain of, let's say, strategic, we know what we're doing, diagrammatic, parametric processes. And this is also another example from utilizing environmental data and scripting their consequences. And finally, as a kind of payback and return and reward, that the aleatory can be brought in within a strategic project by calibrating, strategically looking into observer parameters, where we reflect and bring into the domain strategically and reproducibly this kind of ambiguity and channel that ambiguity of continuous rereading and aleatoric understanding of space. Parametric figuration is the title to this. I've elaborated a little bit in the AD article on parametricism. So we're talking not only about object parameters, they might become kinetic, we're talking about ambient parameters and observer parameters. And this way you can kind of calculate and create form and let form disintegrate. You have fields which in objects crystallize as strong symmetrical icons and then disappear again in the kind of and bleed back into the field. You have systems where different perspectives are calibrated, and this is the same ensemble looked at from different sides, resolving into a different character, a top-heavy versus bottom-heavy. And you can create things where an objective order is against changing perspective of a grid turns into kind of circle packing, into kind of wave pattern. Or the reverse, a circle packing is transmuted just by shifting the perspective and manipulating the observer parameter of perspective relation back into kind of gridded condition. So in this sense, we're recuperating within the kind of strategic parametricist project the subjectivity of all architectural constitution of order and organization, and thus reconfirm that as a kind of ongoing communicative dialectic. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Patrik. I think that's a kind of double first in terms of being an articulation of the parametric diagram, but also of the operation of the diagram within the work of Zaha Hadid architects. Well, I'm going to, as quickly as possible, because there's probably not going to be very much time for questions, but I'm just going to discuss in my presentation, outline some of the futures of the diagrams of architecture in a kind of speculative, conjectural way, analysing the roles of new technologies in the futures of the architectural diagram. Firstly, new sensing, mapping, and other spatial information technologies will increase the different types and resolutions of spatial information we can diagram and therefore design with. This is a slide for one of Neil's students, actually. So some examples such as movement, different kinetic, cinematic and evolutionary processes and methodologies in architecture. This is a slide from space syntax. So people, traffic, circulation intensity and so on, in this particular example in the National Gallery in London. Alejandro's not here, so I'm going to show some of his work shamelessly. Looking at climatic factors, environmental performance factors, such as light, temperature, and other kind of environmental performance factors. These often, solar reflectiveness, for example, these often intangible, immaterial environmental parameters. This is a slide of the new Birmingham, FOA's new Birmingham railway station. Other examples, for example, are perhaps more less rigidly correlated. So this is a map or a diagram of emotions in Greenwich. So extremely subjective phenomena like emotions, or in this case their proxy, which is very, very badly correlated proxy, I'd probably say, which is galvanic skin responses diagrammed onto a site, in this case Greenwich. But also looking at diagrams of different kinds of spaces. For example, the diagrammatic relations between real space in Battersea and its virtually correlated space on the internet. There's another slide of that. As different types and massive quantities of information systems in architecture in the city increase, so will the need for their integration, organisation and customisation through personalised, real-time, interactive interfaces. These kinds of global, networked, what I call I-habitable intelligent diagrams are also, as Bill Mitchell at MIT has outlined, converting the real city into a massive diagrammatic interface in its own right. Actuated by systems of interactive geocoding, wireless, personal, and object-embedded technologies. These are from Brian McGrath at the Parsons Institute in New York. The architecturalization and inhabitation of information in virtual spaces through the architectural diagram is already occurring. We've seen this from about 2002 now. As a kind of early prototypical example of this. We've already seen this with the New York Stock Exchange, where customizable real-time diagram architecture becomes inhabitable in itself. So the creation, production and control of distributed information systems, of immaterial systems of architectural and spatial design will increasingly depend on diagrammatic design systems. And today we can diagram almost anything into an architecture. So this is a slide from an MIT Media Lab doctoral student called Alex Dragulescu, who created a software program to create three-dimensional diagrams using a junk mail inbox as an input. I mean, why you'd want to do this with spam is completely beyond me, and though it has some attractive features, it kind of looks like a Gunter Domenic house, I can't really see how and why this would be interesting. But there is an idea here, which is about a way of diagramming projects, processes, and many other things that are important to the methodologies of architecture to create inhabitable 4D kinds of digital memory theatres. Microsoft, by the way, are kind of looking into this, so in a sort of dull way as project management systems, but that's not really what I refer to. But there is an interesting idea here. These kinds of ways of using and inhabiting the sort of phenomenologies of dense, high-resolution communication, information and knowledge flows in their spaces could help in the understanding, design and organisation of architectural and urban projects and their processes, rather than the final forms and the products. So moving on to real, actual architectures, I mean, all architectural CAD systems now use diagrammatic graphical user interface, or GUI, GUI for short. And as new diagrammatic building information modeling and production systems, BIM for short, and parametric generative design softwares like Grasshopper, generative components, and digital project develop, they will maintain diagrams at the centre of the future of architecture. Here we see slides from Geary Technologies' digital project. The informationalization, synthesis and versioning of multiple systems and patterns in architecture is not new. Christopher Alexander first attempted this in the late 1970s. So I'm really talking about here is multiple systems being synthesized together. And this was, as I say, this is a diagram of Christopher Alexander's. You can see his kind of cybernetic system, him trying to design with this kind of cybernetic system. But his method couldn't deal with the overwhelming number of permutations that the system would demand. You can see here kind of how his patterns might relate to each other and so on in a single example. And compare this to the next example, which is a slide from Grasshopper that Amanda Levitt gave me in October 2009 last year for her tower in Shoreditch. This is for the development of an envelope for the skin of this tower, and you can see there the brise soleil and the window ledges that are in development here. So let's just kind of move between these two because I think it's quite interesting. And you can see here the diagrammatic continuities and similarities where parametric diagrams are operating. So you compare these two. This slide here, what's being designed is the relationships in the boxes in the diagrams on the left, not the final form. And this is quite interesting because it's quite a revolutionary shift where the architect or the designer is manipulating these relationships, these diagrams, not drawings, not models. Okay, so this is kind of quite an important revolutionary development. This is a slide from VPL, Visual Programming Language Environment, called Viper, being used to diagram molecules and folding structures of proteins. Visual programming languages, which are sometimes called diagrammatic programming languages, enable programmers to build their own programs, to script, to write code and so on, without typing stuff in a sort of incomprehensible language, or language that you need to learn before you actually operate the programs and so on. So that's diagrammatically rather than textually. This is a really significant and revolutionary shift in design, and is probably one of the most important revolutions to occur in computing since the GUI revolution, because actually it's applying GUI to programming. So this is a kind of a major seismic shift. I have a sort of disagreement with Lars Spybrook, Professor of Architecture at Georgia Tech. And this is a diagram that I asked him to make in an interviewed conversation with him. And you can see here, he thinks the diagram is going to die in code. So coding and scripting programming are going to kill the diagram off, basically. The diagram is going to become a kind of expression, if you like. I think he's wrong. I think visual programming is going to be the kind of apotheosis of the diagram, if you like, and it's going to more push the diagram firmly into the future of architecture. So this is a sort of simulation of a head-up display. So I'm going to talk a little bit about head-up displays now quickly. So as GUIs become more intimate parts of ourselves and become more intimate parts of our lives and how we interrelate to architecture in the city, they're going to become further and further integrated into our own bodies. In films like Minority Report that you can see here, in films, other films like Batman and so on, this is Batman's lair in The Dark Knight. Again, this is a slide from the final scene where Batman manages to reprogram all the mobile phones in a city to create this kind of panoptic diagram, sonar diagram, so you can see everything that's happening in the city. It's actually a rip-off from Ben Rubin's Ear studio installation of about 2007. You can see here, and again in films like Iron Man, where the future kinds of digital uses of the diagram are simulated. You can see here where this is in the film, it's actually rotating. It's a 4-dimensional diagram. These kinds of immersive head-up displays and ubiquitous diagrams will become more prevalent. And here in Avatar, where the military plan their complex maneuvers and systems using these kind of 4-dimensional diagrams, actually. So these kind of design and control systems seem like science fiction, and we've seen them in all these famous films, in Star Trek, for example. Again, here's another slide from Avatar. They're actually not science fiction. This is a slide from Central London Police CCTV control and emergency response terminal. So these kinds of systems kind of already exist in the city, and ultimately are leading to the control and redesign of our cities right now in London now. These kinds of HUDs and diagrammatic interfaces will also become parts of our bodies. So now moving towards what beyond the nanotechnology to consider pico and femto technologies. Experiments with space at the smallest fundamental levels are going on now. This is a slide from the CERN Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland that was switched on in 2008. And the way that scientists understand, interface, control the most fundamental aspects of space are with these kind of diagrammatic interfaces. So to misquote Sherry Turkle, in the future we will increasingly have to take architecture at its interface value. Lastly, I think the future also sees a role, just go back to that, a growing role for critical, fictional, utopian and dystopian diagrams. Though Robert Somol and Anthony Vidler in the two papers in my book highlight the diagram's futurological utopian powers, it's Vidler who explicitly states this when he writes, and I quote, of the diagram as an instrument of and for utopia. All utopias are in some sense diagrams. So utopian diagrams of space are kind of one useful way forward, but let's not also forget the dystopian diagram. So this is a slide from AVL, Telly van Lieshout, which is a kind of, it's called the Technocrat. It's a kind of subversion and satire of sustainability, of capitalism, and actually of the utopian diagrammatic project itself. So these kinds of diagrams that focus on new sociocultural, moral and the political dimensions of future spatial design will also be technologically enhanced and enabled. This is a slide Ingo Günther from New York from a project called World Processor made for me. This is a kind of open source project where people can submit their own diagrams of various kinds of global international phenomena. So some examples are things like CO2 emissions, refugee migrations, access to drinking water, deaths from tobacco, life expectancy, man-made disasters, and so on. So to conclude, because we've only got about 10 minutes for questions, the possible new roles of new technologies in the future diagrams of architecture may help us to understand our relations to space and its possible futures in previously impossible and inconceivable ways, because, as Rem Koolhaas claims, architecture, and I quote, can become a way of thinking about anything, the diagram of everything. Thank you very much. So if I could just ask our panel to take some seats while the microphones are switched on, and I'll ask a couple of questions, very brief questions, and then I'll open the discussion up to the audience so you can ask your own questions as well. Are we on? Okay. So this is a question, really, kind of provocative question. The model and the drawing are dead. Long live the diagram? Question mark.
I find it very difficult to announce the death of anything. I think that we're very prone to a variety of reductivist thoughts about what constitutes contemporary architecture, and so I would be. Can't hear it. Am I not on? Shall I lean on? I think we're very reductivist in contemporary architecture, and I'd be very scared to announce the death of anything. And in fact, I think we should be revitalise quite a lot of our previous ways of contemplating the architectural environment, as well as augmenting it with a lot of the contemporary technologies. So I'm not going to announce any death in the near future.
Hanif, Patrick? Any imminent funerals?
No, I mean, of course, the diagram, we would inflate the meaning of that concept unduly if we think we could create a full architecture just by diagrams. That would mean the full kind of CD set or the full DP model with every bolt and welding concretely allocated and measured. I don't think we should call that a diagram. You know, we would have to ask, like, what would we gain by such an assimilation of meaning? So no, it is a component, and it's a component which is characterized or called across all those four categories of the diagram I've developed by its relative abstraction, and therefore potential openness and breadth of application.
Right. I'm going to open this up to the audience now to give you a chance to ask any questions. Any questions for any of our panelists? Or have we all drummed you into dumbness? No? Okay, well, I'm going to ask one more question then to everyone, actually. So this is open to the panel and the audience. In terms of the future, kind of from the analysis of the diagram that you've heard today and you've seen today, what is missing? What is there still left to look at? So what would Diagrams of Architecture 2, Volume 2, what would it look at? My own response to that would be that it would look at probably biotechnologies, nanotechnologies, artificial intelligence, interaction design, business and management, city planning, and so on. Some of the kind of intangible post-biological factors of humanity, multiculturalism, and so on, the social sciences and engineering. What's missing?
Well, Hanif? I think we kind of entered a new paradigm, and we've reached a certain degree of maturity, but there's a lot which must be kind of further integrated. I want to keep it a bit more closer to architecture, rather than talking about the sciences and the engineering disciplines. I think what is important step perhaps, which wasn't in what I've shown here, but which is happening in some places, but not maybe sophisticated enough, is kind of diagrammatic or let's say simulation processes which get to grips with the configuration and communication patterns of users relative to spatial configuration. So the kind of agent modeling or the type of modeling and representational devices which are now capturing not only the artifact, the physical construct, and anticipate that, but anticipate human interaction, congregation, communication within such spaces, and there are tools developing for that. Space Syntax is actually developing particular expertise in this. We have in DRL done this under the research heading of responsive environments, where we always modeled, and that means trying to anticipate. It's not that you could literally predict with certainty, but you can use the new kind of digital design tools to enhance your imagination and create a medium where you successively, over iterations and so deepening, also develop these kind of use scenarios on various scales. It's easiest when it's just about circulation patterns and urban, on the urban scale. But I'm also interested to bring that more detailed into simulating scenarios. I would say that's at the moment insufficiently developed, but I see a good kind of project there, which comes to the heart of what's really interesting in terms of the social communication process, which this kind of new architecture in the end has to relate to, and in this that's where the kind of demonstration has to lie in the end.
So That's a kind of the interaction design disciplines are much better at doing this in their use of kind of social sciences, anthropology, ethnology, and so on. So they work like people like Tony Dunn at the Department of Interaction Design at the Royal College of Art. So more human interaction. Yes, definitely. Okay, so I'm going to just close that now, and for lack of human interaction from the audience, and say thank you very much to the AA for hosting the event, and also finally to Helen Castle, my editor at Wiley, who's probably the best editor that I could wish for, and who's helped to make this book happen for all of us. So thanks very much. Thanks also to the panellists for coming.